Hello First Form. In this video we are going to look at the difference between plant and animal cells, and we're going to have a look at some cell structures, so different parts of the cell, and we're going to particularly focus on the spelling of those parts of the cells, and we're going to have a look at their functions as well. So this is really important information to learn, so take your time as you go through this video. When you're taking notes in your booklet, do it really carefully, particularly focusing on your spelling, because that's going to be really important. So if you turn in your booklet to page 5, I know we haven't fully completed page 4, but we're going to actually go back to that afterwards. What I want to do is have a look at an animal cell and a plant cell, and then I'll take you back to the function of each of those parts. And actually what I want you to do is, as we go through the parts of our plant and animal cells, I want you to listen out for the function. I'll explain that as we go along, but then we'll go through it on page 4. So if you turn to page 5 in your booklet, if you haven't already done so, and we'll start with an animal cell. So if I just zoom in here, animal cells, this is a general animal cell. What you'll find in animals, which we'll look at in a later lesson, is that there are different specialised cells. So cells that look slightly different because they have a different purpose. So for example, the cell that I have just added to the screen, that is what we call a sperm cell, which we'll take a look at later in this topic. You can see that looks quite different than the cell on the screen, the typical animal cell, but actually it has very similar parts to it, all the same parts that a normal animal cell does. It's just maybe a slightly different shape, and that helps it with its function. So that's what we call a specialised cell, one that has a special shape or special structure to help it with its job. But what we're looking at now is a typical animal cell and then a typical plant cell. So what we want to do in this video is look at the different parts, the different structures of these typical animal and plant cells. You need to be able to label a cell fully and confidently. You need to be able to spell the parts of the cell correctly, and you need to know their function or their job. What do they do in the cell? What job do they contribute to the working of a cell? So as I said, this first cell is a typical animal cell. You might want to write that in bigger writing. It is down here, but just to make it more obvious that this is an animal cell. And if you try and remember, a typical animal cell is actually simpler than a typical plant cell. I know that might be quite surprising, but actually a typical animal cell is simpler than a plant cell. So there are not just quite as many parts. There's 3 main parts, and then we're going to look at this nuclear membrane as well. So there's 3 main parts of a typical animal cell, and I'm going to label those with you now. Again, can I just encourage you to be really careful that you copy the spelling exactly when you're writing this into your notes. So the first thing that's perhaps the most obvious is this darker circle type structure in the centre. And it is called the nucleus. So you can wait until I'm completely finished if you prefer. It is spelled Nucleus. So maybe write that down and then check again. Have I definitely spelt that correctly? So that's Nucleus. So that's the nucleus of the cell. And what that does is it stores the genetic information, the genetic material of the cell. So when a cell is reproducing, it contains like your DNA, your chromosomes, your genes, and things that will pass on information when cells are reproducing. So it contains or stores the genetic material. It also controls the cell and all its activities. So sometimes the nucleus is referred to as like the brain of the cell because it controls what the cell does. So that is the nucleus. Then there's another part of the animal cell that is already labelled for you. That's the nuclear membrane. And that simply just contains the contents of the nucleus. It just keeps it all together within the nucleus. It's like a barrier as such. It just stores all the contents that are in the nucleus. So it's almost like a wall around the outside of the nucleus, keeping everything inside it. So you do need to know that part, and you do need to know its spelling. So perhaps even maybe write out the spelling underneath so that you have a bit of practice. So nuclear membrane. Let's go on up the left hand side. The next part that you need to label is a part called the cytoplasm. So that is CYTOPLASM. So the cytoplasm. So be really careful about the spelling of that one. That one's particularly tricky. And that's a thick liquidy solution that fills each cell, and it's where the chemical reactions of the cell take place. So chemical reactions that you've heard of, like respiration, that will happen in the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm, cytoplasm. That's a thick liquidy solution where the chemical reactions of the cell take place, for example, respiration. Okay, next one, and this is the last part that you need to know for an animal cell. This is what we call the cell membrane. So that is spelled cell, which is C-E-L-L. Membrane is spelled M-E-M-B-R-A-N-E. So the cell membrane. And you can think of the cell membrane as almost like a fence around the cell. A bit like the nuclear membrane, it contains all the contents of the cell and it controls what goes into and out of the cell. So in order for the likes of respiration to happen, things will have to pass into the cell, like glucose and oxygen. So the cell membrane will let things like that into the cell, and it will let things out, like carbon dioxide and water, that are made in respiration. But there are other things that are maybe harmful to the cell where the cell membrane would not let those things in. So the cell membrane, we give it a special name, a fancy name called semi-permeable. What that means is that it'll let some things in and it will let some things out, but not others. Now, you don't need to learn that term at this stage, but almost think of the cell membrane as like the bodyguard of the cell. So it lets some things in, but not others, and it lets some things out, but not others. So it controls what enters and leaves the cell. So those are the different parts of the animal cell. There's only 4 in total that you need to learn. So the nucleus, which contains the genetic information and controls the cell. The cytoplasm, which is a thick liquid solution that fills the cell and where the chemical reactions take place. And the cell membrane, which contains all the contents of the cell and controls what enters and leaves the cell. And then finally the nuclear membrane, that's probably best learnt with the nucleus. And it just surrounds the nucleus, contains the contents of the nucleus. And so if you label it as almost the very edge of the nucleus, if you were asked to label that in an exam. So those are the 4 parts of the animal cell. Make sure you learn those, learn their spelling and learn their function, which we'll come back to on page 4. The next cell diagram on page 5 is a typical plant cell. So it looks a little different than our animal cell. It has more structures, so it looks a little bit more complicated, and there are more parts to learn here, so just be careful with this. And again, this is a typical plant cell. Not all plant cells will look like this. For example, we saw our onion cell actually doesn't look like this. There are a couple of structures that are missing from an onion cell, and we'll talk about that in a wee second. But this would be your typical plant cell. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and see how many of these parts that you can label already based on what we've looked at from the animal cell. So essentially the 4 parts that we saw in the animal cell, they are also here in this plant cell. So pause the video now and see if you can label those, and then we will label the extra bits together. So pause the video now and give that a go. Okay, so hopefully you've given that a go. And let's label those parts that we've seen in the animal cell together. So the first thing you might have noticed would have been the nucleus. So here's the nucleus here. So it's N-U-C-L-E-U-S. Again, be really careful about your spelling. So that's the nucleus. Again, just like in an animal cell, it contains the genetic information of the plant. And it will control the cell and the cell's activities. Then around the outside of the nucleus, we will have the nuclear membrane. And remember, that essentially just stores the contents of the nucleus, so it just keeps everything together within the nucleus. So just be careful about your spelling of nuclear. It's N-U-C-L-E-A-R, and then membrane, M-E-M-B-R-A-N-E. Another thing you might have spotted is just labelled above the nucleus, and that is your cytoplasm. So that is C-Y-T-O-P-L-A-S-M. So that's the cytoplasm, and that's your thick liquidy solution that fills the cell and where the chemical reactions of the cell take place, for example, like respiration. And the last part was maybe a little bit harder to identify, but it's actually this one on the top right. Here is our cell membrane. Our cell membrane is actually on the inside of what we call the cell wall. So it's actually that inner line. So can you see that border around the outside of the plant cell? So I've coloured that quite poorly in yellow, and you can do the same just to show that. That's what we call the cell wall. So you can see, unlike an animal cell, a plant cell has a thick cell wall. And that gives plant cells their shape, it gives them a rigid shape, and it supports the cell. But plant cells also have the cell membrane, which just runs along the inside of the cell wall. So if you want to make that really clear, that line, that label, should go directly to the inside line. So just make that really clear. I know there's a tiny wee gap there, but that inner line is what we would label the cell membrane. And again, just like in the animal cell, it controls what enters and leaves the cell, and it contains the contents of the cell. So it has the same function as it does in the animal cell, but the plant cells also have this extra cell wall. So what we'll do now is those are the 4 parts that are consistent and similar to the animal cell, but we'll label the other parts of the plant cell now. I'm going to do them in a different colour. So the ones I've written here in green are the same as the animal cell. But the ones that I'll write them in pink here. These are the ones that only a plant cell contains. So let's label the cell wall first of all. So this is the cell wall. So we usually just label that either the outside border or the bit kind of in between, just as written here. So that's cell, C-E-L-L, and then wall, just a normal spelling, W-A-L-L. And the cell wall, as I said, supports the cell, and it gives it a more rigid shape. Okay, then down on the right hand side we have a couple of features here. The one in the middle is what we call the vacuole of the cell. So that's spelled V-A-C-U-O-L-E. That's the vacuole of the cell. Now the vacuole contains a watery solution called cell sap, and we'll look at that in a second on page 5. So it contains a watery solution called cell sap, and it also acts as a food store for the plant. So any food that it makes in photosynthesis, it stores it in the vacuole until the plant cell needs to use it. So that's the job of the vacuole. And a bit like what we saw with the cell and the nucleus, the vacuole also has a membrane. And we simply call that the vacuole membrane. So that's spelled V-A-C-U-O-L-E, and then membrane, M-E-M-B-R-A-N-E. So the vacuole membrane. And then there's one last part to look at in our plant cell, and that's what we call the chloroplasts. And we talked a wee bit about these before, but I don't expect you to remember those. The chloroplasts are these things down at the bottom. We'll write them in first of all. So that's spelled C-H-L-O-R-O-P-L-A-S-T-S. Those are the chloroplasts. C-H-L-O-R-O-P-L-A-S-T-S. And the chloroplasts are filled with a pigment, a chemical called chlorophyll, and that pigment traps sunlight for photosynthesis. So the chloroplasts are really important, and they are the structure that contains the chemical that will trap sunlight and allow photosynthesis to take place. So that chemical that they contain, that chemical called chlorophyll, is actually green in colour, and that's what gives plants and leaves their green colour, that pigment chlorophyll, which are contained in the chloroplasts. So to maybe help you remember that and remember the job of it, what I would suggest is that you colour in all of those chloroplasts in green if you have a green colouring pencil. And you can see there are multiple chloroplasts in this plant cell. So I've done that now on my diagram. Again, my colouring in's not very good on the iPad, but you can make yours a wee bit neater. So you might want to colour those in green to make them stand out. So again, you can see the plant cell is more complex than the animal cell. And this is a typical plant cells. Not all plant cells will look exactly like this, and we'll look at that in a later lesson. But I'd like you to make sure that those are labelled. Double check your spelling now, even pause the video and double check your spelling, because you want to be learning it correctly. That will be part of the rest of your work for today, is learning these parts, learning their spellings and learning their functions. So what I'd like you to do now is to go back to page 4. You'll remember that we left this table out at the time, just because I thought it would be helpful to label the parts of the cell and talk through those before you had a look at these structures and their functions. So now you can actually picture where they are in the cell, and we've talked through their function. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause this video and see what you can do yourself in filling in this table. Can you remember the function of, say, for example, the nucleus or the cell membrane or the vacuole that is missing here in the table? And then where the other functions are given to you, can you remember which structure that matches up with? And then finally, what you need to do in the final columns is to say whether these features are present in the plant cell and in the animal cell, and that's just simply a yes or no. So using the information we filled in on page 5 and the information I talked you through, I want you to pause the video and see if you can try and fill in this table yourself. What you may want to do is also just to go back and watch this video and listen to me explaining it again, but rather than labelling your cell parts, to fill in this table as I talk through the functions of each of the structures and whether or not they're in a plant or animal cell. So I'd like you to do that yourself. You'll get a lot more from that trying it yourself rather than just copying in the answers. So I'd like you to give that a go now. Try and fill in the table as much as you can from what you remember, or go back and rewatch the video and fill it in as you go along, as you listen to me talk through the different parts. Fill in this page. And then what I'm going to do is to show you the filled table, what it should look like at the end. So either pause this video now if you're going to give it a go yourself from what you can remember from what I've been talking through, or to scroll back to the start of the video and to watch through again. But make sure that you've had a go at this yourself, because what I'll then do at the end of the video now is to give you the completed version and check through it with you. So I'm now going to go through what your filled table should look like. So if you haven't already done so, pause or rewatch the video and give this a go yourself. So first of all, we have our nucleus, and you should have written that the function of the nucleus is that it stores the genetic material or the genetic information and controls the cell. Yes, it is part of a plant cell, and yes, it is present in an animal cell too. Next, we have our cytoplasm, and can I ask that you check your spelling? cytoplasm. That's where the chemical reactions of the cell take place. And cytoplasm is present in a plant cell, and it is present in an animal cell. I should say you should take a different coloured pen at this point and mark your work and write in anything that you've missed in a different coloured pen, or correct your work. Next, we have our cell membrane, and the cell membrane contains the cell contents and controls what passes in and out of the cell. We talked about it being a bit like a bodyguard. And yes, the cell membrane is present in the plant cell, and yes, the cell membrane is present in the animal cell. So that should say yes as well. So please mark that. Next cell structure is the nuclear membrane. So it's NU and then CLEAR. So NU and then the word clear. Membrane, MEMBRANE, check your spelling, and it contains the contents of the nucleus. Yes, it's present in both plant and animal cells, and that's because both of them contain a nucleus, and the nucleus is surrounded by this nuclear membrane. Next structure we have is the cell wall, CELLWALL, and that supports the cell, and you could add in that it gives it a rigid shape. So it gives it a more robust shape than an animal cell would have. So yes, it's present in a plant cell, but no, it is not present in the animal cell. Next, we have the chloroplasts, and they trap light in photosynthesis. Remember, they contain a chemical called chlorophyll, and that's a green pigment. That's what gives leaves their green colour. And so the chloroplasts, their job, their function, is to trap light in photosynthesis. So yes, they're present in a plant cell, but no, they're not present in an animal cell. And that's why we can't make our own food by photosynthesis, because we don't have chloroplasts, and that's why we're not green. So if we had chloroplasts, our skin would be green. And then finally in this table we have the vacuole, and that contains a watery solution called cell sap, which is just SAP, and then you can say that it acts as a food store, so it's where the plant stores its food. So yes, it's present in a plant cell, and no, it's not present in an animal cell. There's one part that we labelled in our diagrams that's not here, which you may want to write just at the bottom. So you may want to add an extra row, as I have done, and that part is the vacuole membrane. It contains the contents of the vacuole. So yes, it's present in a plant cell, but no, it's not present in an animal cell, because there is no vacuole in the animal cell. So you may want to add that in at the bottom. So this table acts as a summary of the different structures in a cell, the different parts of a cell and their function. If you want to write in the heading of that, the word function just means the job. What's its purpose in the cell? What does it do in the cell? And then whether or not it's in a plant, a cell and an animal cell. So what you can see is that the first four parts of the structures in this table are both animal and plant cells. So you may want to write that at the side of your table, or highlight them in a particular colour: nucleus, cytoplasm, cell membrane and nuclear membrane. Those parts are in both plant and animal cells. And then our final four, our cell wall, our chloroplasts, our vacuole and our vacuole membrane, those are in plant cells only. So you may want to highlight those in a particular colour, maybe the likes of green, to remind you that it's in plant cells only. So the cell wall, chloroplasts, vacuole and vacuole membrane are in plant cells only. So what I want you to do with the rest of your time in this lesson is to spend a wee bit of time learning the spelling of these different structures, and learning their functions, and learning whether they're in an animal cell, in a plant cell or in both. And in your lesson later in the week, your final lesson of your week, and be that Thursday or Friday in your single, I'm going to give you a test on Microsoft Forms, again similar to the one you would have done with the microscope, on the different structures and functions of the cell parts. You need to be able to label a plant and animal cell with the correct spelling of the structures, and then also to learn the function or jobs of the animal and plant cells. And this information is really important right up to GCSE, so it's really important that you learn these really well. So I want you to spend a bit of time learning them, and I've given you one activity to help you do that, which I'll explain now. So this worksheet is on Microsoft Teams in your files section of your Science Teams page, and I have put it together to help you learn the parts of the cell, their spelling and their functions. This is really important information to learn, which is why I'm going to give you a quick quiz on it on Thursday. So the most helpful way to use this worksheet, girls, would be to print it out if you can, but I realise that not all of you will have access to a printer at home, in which case you can do one of two things. You can either open it up on an app on your iPad. For example, I use Explain Everything to put together these videos, to write over your notes, things like that. So that's called Explain Everything. You should be able to download that from Meraki, I think, or there's apps like Note Shelf. Give those a go. If you're not sure what to do with that, then do let me know. Or if you can open them up in notes on your iPad, or whatever it may be that you can write over it. Or what you could do is to, for example, draw out these cells, or do it just on file paper or blank paper. You should be able to do that. Just label it clearly, part 1, part 2, part 3 and so on. And this is really just to help you with your revision for that quiz, because I would like you to try that quiz without your notes to see how well you've learned these different parts of the cell. And as I said, this is going to be really important for Key Stage 3. And for your GCSE science, so it's really important that you learn these spellings correctly and the functions of them now. So let me take you through the worksheet really quickly. Part 1 should be straightforward. It's labelling your cells. So you need to write whether it's an animal or a plant cell over at the side. So it says this is, and you'll either write an animal cell or you'll write a plant cell. And then for the second one, this is either an animal cell or a plant cell. And then where the lines are drawn, you need to label it. So for example, this first one will be cytoplasm. And try and do it from memory. So try and spend a bit of time learning the parts from your notes and then try this from memory as part of your revision. Then part 2 is learning the spelling of the structures. So as I said, it's really important that you can spell these correctly. And so what I've given you here is a little bit of an opportunity to practice the spelling. So if I zoom in here, I have given you the correct spelling of each of the 8 parts that you need to learn. And I want you to practice writing them out. So what I've suggested is that the first time you just copy them directly. So for example, for nucleus, you would just be copying out, that's Nucleus, practicing it again underneath. And then what I want you to do is to try a method called look, say, cover, write, check. For example, and what that means is look at the word, say it out loud, cover it, write it, and then check it, okay? And see, can you do that correctly? So I've given you space to write out your spellings, and I've said for the last 3, try and use that method. Look at the word, say it out loud, so nucleus, cover it up, so even just with your hand, cover it up, you don't need to scribble it out, write it out, and then check it. And if you're wrong, make sure you correct it, okay? And then do that 5 times for each word. Hopefully that makes sense. So those are your 8 parts there. There's 6 on this page. And then there's 2 on the next page. And then part 3 is finally to learn the functions of the cell structures. So it's really important that you know the function of each cell structure. So what I've given you here is a table to fill out by yourself with a different name of the 8 parts and the 8 structures, then write its function beside it. And then you've got the option, you don't have to use this final column, but just if it helps, you might want to give the cell part a nickname to help you learn the function, something that would help you learn what it does. So I've given you the example of a cell membrane. So you can write it in any order, but you would write the name of the cell first, just check your spelling, be really careful about that. Then you'd write the function beside it. So it controls what enters and leaves the cell. Use your table on page 4 to help you with this, but again, spend a bit of time learning the functions first and see if you can fill out this table from memory. And then you could give it a nickname. I've suggested the nickname the bodyguard, and that's because it controls what enters in and leaves the cell. So it lets some things in and some things out, but not others. So that's just an option. You may not be able to think of one for each part, but that might help you associate the function with the correct structure. So I hope that helps you with your revision. Don't just fill it in sort of passively, don't just copy your notes. Try and learn your notes, learn the spellings, learn the different parts first, and then try to fill in this worksheet as revision. And then if you have any extra time, you could maybe make your own revision notes, or just spend a wee bit of time learning these so that you're ready to do that little quiz from memory on Thursday or Friday.